an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, welcome in. Here we go. It's Tuesday, May the 9th, 2023. Dave Trafford here. It's Now and Next for Story Studio Network. The day's barely started, and we're into our second show. We normally have Now and Next, as you know, running Monday to Thursday. And Thursday of late has been the feed drop. So if you haven't checked it out, we've been featuring the first show that we produced in Story Studio Network. It's called The Next Normal. And we've been laying on the episodes as we get through the next couple of months, actually. It's going to take us through. There's like 12 shows. And it was a round table of big brains who sat around and kind of looked at where we were in the COVID era. And what were the things that the lessons that we needed to learn, the opportunities that we could take advantage of. And last week we got into this whole conversation about how the future of work has shifted so dramatically because of COVID, and not necessarily for the worst. I mean, there are some things that are advantageous. So this Thursday we'll feature The Next Normal as well. And but normally Friday we would have On the Ledge. Today we dropped On the Ledge because it's been 5 years since John Wright and I started that show. It was a daily show during the election campaign here in the province in 2018, the election campaign that landed Doug Ford in the Premier's chair here in Ontario. So it's kind of a big day for us here at Story Studio Network. This particular episode of Now and Next is the 1000th and 111th show episode that we've produced in the last 5 years. So we've been a little busy, and it's been kind of a fun ride. So to mark the occasion, by accident or design, happy to welcome in David Coletto. He is the founder, chair, and CEO at Abacus Data. How are you, David?
Well, Dave, and congrats on an excellent run, contributing to the conversation. Happy to be here.
Well, and you know, the cool thing about it is during COVID, I was just talking to Sabrina Nanji. She is the publisher and editor of the Queen's Park Observer. And she launched her business during COVID. And I talked to David Hollett, who is the publisher at Next magazine, formerly from the original publisher of Now magazine. He did it during COVID. And I thought, are you a little courageous or maybe a little crazy? I'm not quite sure. But, you know, it's interesting to me, and I'm throwing something at you that you might not have otherwise thought of, but you get a sense that people were more willing to take a step into that in terms, particularly around providing context and information for people, because the number of clients who came to me during COVID, unbidden, to tell their stories through podcasting, blew me away. I mean, I went from doing 2 or 3 shows when COVID was declared. 3 or 4 months later, I was working on 12 shows, and I only pitched one of them. Ironically, it was the COVID podcast. But there seemed to be this real need for organizations, individuals, business, whatever it was, to cut through, I think, a lot of the noise around COVID, to be able to say, hey, this is important to us, and here's, you know, how we are either contributing to the opportunities that are going to arise, or don't, you know, our brand is strong, we have to deal with this. Daily Bread Food Bank, we have a crisis on our hands, get out in front of people. I didn't think of that until recently in terms of how this is all accelerated. And Sabrina said the same thing to me. She had the same kind of, you know, anecdotal response to her when she launched her newsletter.
No, I think 3 things are at work here. One is during COVID, most people were stuck at home. And, you know, if you turned on the mainstream news organizations, it was COVID 24/7. And I think there was a real desire to share people's perspectives on other issues and how it might relate to the pandemic. We had a lot of time on our hands. or at least we felt we did. And so this was an opportunity to do something maybe we always wanted to do and didn't have the time. Number two is we've been tracking this regularly is the number of Canadians who are listening to podcasts has doubled in like 3 years, right? So 15%, it's still not everybody, but 15% say they listen to a podcast every day. And so the demand for the content it accelerated during COVID because, again, people had a lot of time. You'd go for a walk all alone and you needed somebody to talk to you and listen to you. And I think that podcasts I have my own that also started during COVID. I think they're a great way to connect with an audience because you can get a little deeper into a topic, and it's a very intimate way of expressing your views and your opinions and different perspectives. And then the last, I think, point is in an environment where we are seeing a decline in traditional news organizations. I think shows like yours and others are filling that void, and so there's never been more choice for what we listen to, but that also means you can get that content out. So I think it was like a perfect storm that the pandemic created that accelerated some of the trends we were seeing and then gave people the opportunity to do something they never thought they might have the time or even the ability to do.
Well, I don't know if you've crossed paths with Jeff Vidler at Signal Hill Insights, but he and his team have been following that, going very deeply on the podcast trends and talking about a new business. The question was always, how can you make a living doing this? What has struck me about all of this is the degree to which brands have seen this as being a viable, necessary part of their communications and marketing strategy. It's not just a standalone to say, hey, look at me. They're using it very deliberately and effectively because, as you point out, everything's COVID during the pandemic. I used to do work with folks to get them earned media. Pre-pandemic, I could do that off the side of my desk because I had a really great media list. I knew everybody across the country. I could pick up the phone or send an email and say, David's got this really great story you should tell. Boom. And we could get you on whatever show. COVID comes along, all the oxygen taken up by that. And quite literally, I worked on a campaign, David, for about 3 months, and I got like zero uptake. And that was just astonishing to me. So what I did to the client, and the client was actually prepared to say, okay, well, thanks for trying. That was good effort. And I thought, no, wait. So I said, let's make sure that you get something out of this. So we turned their money into, a limited podcast series, which is basically what they wanted to get to the media. And 3 years later, the CEO of that company still drops an episode of that in their LinkedIn page every once in a while to articulate something that's come up in the news or whatever and how it affects their business. So that the posture of media has actually foundationally changed, and brands and organizations are seeing that this is a way of using that tool to leverage earned media or just to get into your ear. Aaron, our CEO, will tell you that this is, intimacy at scale, basically, is how she approaches podcasting. So there's a really interesting emergence of the power of this medium. And I say that not because I'm in it, because I'm discovering this as I go along all of a sudden. There's an acknowledgement of it, that this is kind of where things are living right now.
And I think it's going to only get more intense, or the demand for it will grow as we move into a world where, AI is producing so much of other kinds of content that people are going to crave real conversations with real people. And so I think the future is really bright for this medium.
Yeah. So, and thanks for being here. And I didn't anticipate getting into that conversation with you, but I'm glad we did. I wanted to actually talk to you about the the big weekend, the Liberal prom that was held in Ottawa over the weekend. And it sounded as though, the Prime Minister was the belle of the ball and has decided that he's hanging in. He's going to be there for the next election. And I was talking to Keith Leslie about this last week, and he said, I'm sure there were a lot of people who went, yay! There was a sort of a tepid enthusiasm for this, that in fact, it's his party. Clearly, it's the Trudeau party. And he's in control fully. Unless he wants to step down, nothing's going to change there. What are the prospects? I mean, internally, I can see, maybe nobody better. But how does that shift the landscape, or at all, based on your view?
I've always had the view that, maybe if Liberals are reluctantly embracing Trudeau, to your point, I think you were making, is because they don't see anyone else, at least in the short term, who can, keep the coalition that's helped the Liberals barely, but nonetheless win the last two elections, and that is holding Quebec and Ontario primarily, and keeping kind of urban Canada united around the Liberal Party. We released a poll last week, just before that convention started, that showed pretty much nothing's changed in the last year and a half since the federal election. We've got the Conservatives nationally at 33%, the Liberals at 31%, and the NDP at 19%. So if you go back to the 2021 election, the Conservatives got 34%, the Liberals got 33%, and the NDP got 16%. So slight changes, but all within kind of the margin of error of that survey, which suggests a few things. One is, anyone who is writing off the Liberals and Mr. Trudeau shouldn't do that, because they've demonstrated a resilience to keep winning even under difficult circumstances. But two is that, whenever the next election comes, it will be an even, I think, a steeper hill decline for the Liberals to win, because every year that they're in power, they turn off more and more people. And despite the fact that Mr. Trudeau is probably still the Liberals' greatest asset, half of Canadians say they don't like him outright, and only a third say they have a positive view of him. And those are the worst numbers, and they've been that way for a number of months now. Those are the worst numbers that we've sort of measured of him. So it's a complicated, I think, scenario. But the only thing that I think keeps Liberals really focused and motivated to know that they can still win is that despite the fact that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives have, I think, been more engaging with people than the previous two leaders at this point, not a lot of Canadians have fully thought through the implications of a Conservative government led by Mr. Poilievre. And I think there's a lot of hope, perhaps more hope than rationality, in thinking that once they do start paying attention, they're going to realize he's not an acceptable alternative. And so they will somehow survive, not because of perhaps their own merits, but the faults of their primary opponent.
Well, when we look at that, and you already brought up the need to win Quebec, quite frankly, given the way everything else is likely to break, how critical is it? Quebec is always critical, but how much more critical is it for the Conservatives to say we need to have a foundation in the province of Quebec that is unassailable? I hear a lot of commentary. Thomas Mulcair among them, saying he just doesn't have the clout in Quebec. Period. This is over before it starts.
I think it's not essential that they win a lot of seats, the Conservatives in Quebec. Mr. Harper did it in 2011, right? He won a majority government with some seats in Quebec, but by no means was he popular or did he sweep the province. But on the other hand, unless you're sweeping Ontario, sweeping British Columbia, making big inroads in Atlantic Canada, that majority government is very hard to get without significant support in the second largest province in the country. And all the polling confirms what Mr. Mulcair said, in that the Conservatives at this stage anyways are getting almost no traction in Quebec. In fact, Pierre Poilievre is the least popular, if if you look at the national kind of regional breakouts in Quebec than in any other region of the country. And that's still at a point where not everybody really knows him that well or has seen him in their day-to-day lives. And so I think the prospects for the Conservatives are very difficult. You even have the Premier of Quebec, who in the last federal election all but pretty much endorsed the Conservatives, now appearing to, be buddies with Trudeau and working together in a way like Doug Ford is doing in Ontario. That makes it even harder for someone from Alberta who represents an Ontario riding to break through. Even if Mr. Poilievre has a French name, he's not a Quebecois, and that I think is something that is a barrier for him in that province as well.
The conversation, it's hard to now these days have a discussion around federal politics without looking at the provincial implications. Certainly Quebec being one of them. Here in Ontario, the Ford government seems, as you point out, to be getting along nicely with Trudeau. At the same time, we've got a noise that Mississauga Mayor Bonnie Crombie is preparing to launch a campaign to be the leader of the Ontario Liberals, which would make for an interesting dynamic, I think, not only at Queen's Park, but federally and provincially, Ontario to Ottawa. But paint the relationship picture for me in Alberta, because I can't imagine two political figures being so misaligned than Premier Smith and Prime Minister Trudeau. But yesterday I saw he was talking about aid for Alberta after all the wildfires, and he's calling her by her first name. So there's a real shift there in that level of empathy for a character whom you would think would be, an easy foil.
Well, I think, regardless of where you live, when you're going through a really difficult period, like many Albertans are with these wildfires, you don't want your political leaders, even if you don't like them, in the case of Albertans and how they feel about Mr. Trudeau, to be fighting or to be, taking political jabs at each other in the middle of a provincial election, mind you, when you're going through something like that, right? People, I think, we saw it during the pandemic, at least in the early months of the pandemic, you could put aside your political differences and, roll up your sleeves and try to help people. And I think that's, regardless of your political persuasion, your, most, I would say 90% of people's inclination. That doesn't mean that, that later points in this campaign in Alberta or after the election that they won't go back to their natural position, which is one, I think, of acrimony and fundamental disagreement over, the direction of the country or the province. But during a time like this, it makes sense for both of them to, particularly for Danielle Smith, who's, again, in the midst of a very close election fight, to not be seen as aggravating the leader of a government that can really help the province and can deliver a lot of support, and they need it. They need the military's help. They need the funding to deal with this emergency.
Nobody cheered for COVID, and certainly not cheering for wildfires in Alberta. But I wonder, to your point, in terms of sort of setting down the political, weapons, is whether or not this kind of emergency in Alberta, I won't say pauses the campaign, but slows it down to the benefit of the incumbent.
It certainly does. I've seen evidence of it in other elections where you have a natural disaster like this. And what it does is it allows the premier to be the premier. And one of the knocks on Danielle Smith up to this point, and we've done polling in the province, is that people have felt she doesn't have good judgment. She's not necessarily that competent because some of the decisions and things she said in the past and as premier have really, befuddled a lot of Albertans. This is a moment for her to demonstrate, no, I can bring people together. I can make decisions that aren't political in nature, but are good for the people of the province, regardless of their political orientation. And I think that does benefit an incumbent, right? I was involved in a mayoral election in Cape Breton Regional Municipality, a number of years ago. And in 2018, there the remnants of a hurricane that hit that community very hard. And it happened in the last 2 weeks of a municipal election, which the incumbent was probably going to lose, but ultimately, no one can say for certain, but helped, I think, him reassert his kind of position and get people to see him less as a candidate and more as the community leader, kind of rallying people together. So it does have that effect. We saw it during COVID as well. Everybody, regardless of, except for perhaps Jason Kenney in Alberta, but every provincial premier, the federal leaders, Mr. Trudeau, saw their personal numbers improve substantially in those first few months, as everybody kind of said, we're going to rally around this person who's leading the charge to get us through this.
Mm-hmm. Just in terms of things that move the needle, I was talking to Lisa Wright last week, former Harper cabinet minister, and she was talking about the Chinese interference story. And so from one end, you've got a crisis like the wildfires that really is quite literally in the face of the people who are voting. But then you've got something like the Chinese or foreign interference conversation going on in Ottawa that seems, as much and all as you and I are paying attention to it, for the most part, I think it's not even, top 10 in terms of worries for most people. What's your sense? Because this seems to have gone from a slow drip to almost a fire hose blast. And in terms of characterizing the government for its inability to act in the interest of Canadians. I realize they've kicked out a diplomat, and the Chinese have kicked out one of our diplomats, and that's tit for tat going on right now. And it makes for an interesting headline. Does any of that create a bit of buzz among voters who are going to look at this and say, you should have behaved better in this particular area. You should have protected Canadians better in this particular area. And does it even raise to the level of an issue?
I think you make a really good point, and I think your assessment of it's right. On the surface, people are not going to, whenever the next federal election comes, say, I'm voting against the Liberals or for the Liberals because of how they handled this particular issue. It's a really important issue. And Canadians admit that, but it's not top of mind, and it's not something that they think differentiates, the Liberals or the Conservatives in terms of who would handle Chinese interference better necessarily. But where I do think there's risk for the Liberals, and Mr. Trudeau in particular, is, and Chantal Hébert said this, and I'm paraphrasing her here, but it's this it reaffirms or provides more evidence to some people who may be on the fence towards the Prime Minister and this government generally, that they just can't get their act together. They can't, you hear stories about, Michael Chong, the Conservative MP's family, being targeted and threatened by Chinese officials, and that intelligence getting to a certain level, but not getting to a level that action actually follows through. I think it does raise questions about, like, who's running the government, and are there other things that are happening that we don't know about, or the government's just not aware of because the system's not working right or the processes aren't right. So I think it goes to competence. I think it, and that's a difficult place for a government that's, almost 8 years in office to be faced with. And so that I think is if there's any lasting effect, it's going to be that kind of narrative that takes hold, right? Like the people who are not deeply partisan, but are hearing about stories about government just not delivering or being able to manage. The passport issue is another example. You just can't get passports out, and the airports aren't working. And now, we've known for a long time, and most Canadians believe that China's been trying to interfere and has been interfering, not just in the last year, but for many years. And yet, it for some, it might appear the government can't do anything about it or isn't able to do anything about it. And that, I think, would be more worrying. So that's what I think is the long-term effect. We have seen no immediate impact in polling. In fact, the Conservative lead over the Liberals has shrunk in our polling as this issue has gone on. And I don't think it's because of this issue, but it's in spite of that they keep pressing this issue, hoping there's this perhaps silver, the smoking gun of the Liberals, colluding with China or I don't know what they're trying to get at. But at the end of the day, when you ask people, what are you worried about? They're worried about their cost of living, housing, and healthcare. And if I were the Conservatives, those are the things that I would keep pressing. Because when we ask Canadians to rate the performance of the federal government, those are the three things they get the worst marks on. And so I don't get the strategy from the Conservatives because it's not moving the numbers for them. But if it's a part of a broader attempt to demonstrate the inability for the government to actually govern, then that might be successful in the long term.
When you talk about those issues that are top of mind for voters, is there a regional imbalance, I'll say, where it's more concerning in particular parts of the country, or is it pretty constant?
It's more or less consistent right across the country. I mean, in British Columbia, housing in particular is higher up. If you ask that question in the Greater Toronto Area, housing is overwhelmingly close to number one. But those three issues, I think, for Canadians in all parts of the country are top of mind, and they're only getting worse. I think people are not feeling, whether it's their provincial government or the federal government or even their municipal governments, frankly, that anything is getting done to solve it. And on the one hand, they recognize that, for example, to fix the healthcare system, it's going to take time. But nonetheless, people are still worried about, if they need emergency care, how long are they going to wait at an emergency room to get that? As are people. I think housing is increasingly becoming a deeply problematic issue for all levels of government, because it feels like, despite a slight correction in the housing market, that it's actually harder today to either pay your rent or buy a home than it was only a few years ago. And it really doesn't feel like, no one believes anything that anyone's doing is having any effect on it.
Yeah, the horizon doesn't seem to offer much light or glimmer of hope, and I think it doesn't matter what political stripe you are. That's a challenge for anybody right now in government or in politics in terms of vis-a-vis leadership, because if you want to come out with the big ideas, to your point, it's going to price tag and long-term implementation. People want stuff to happen now.
They do, and I mean, I know I worked a little bit in this space on housing, and it's such a complicated policy area, because even if you, let's say, as you hear Doug Ford say, speed up approval processes, remove the red tape that slows housing developments, you still need people to build the homes, and there's a trade person shortage in the province. So there's lots of barriers to act. Even if you have everything set up from a policy wise to get more homes built, you still got to build those homes. They don't get built overnight, and you need people to build them. And at the same time, our population continues to grow pretty rapidly, that even if you build the homes, somebody's going to take them. And so it's a very challenging policy space, which is why I think none of the parties, both in Ontario, federally, are really seen as necessarily doing better on this issue. It's almost like people have just sort of said, I've given up hope, but it doesn't stop the anxiety, particularly young people are feeling right now about it.
Well, in fact, I think it might amplify the anxiety. I mean, to some degree, it just kind of feeds on itself, right?
It does. And if no one actually can get control of this issue, then I've got to figure out how I'm going to solve for it. And it's one of those issues that there's a hopelessness of it, right? Like, I can move to a smaller community outside of the big urban centers, but what does that mean for my employment and my family and all those other things that are part of it that just add more and more levels of anxiety onto all of that.
Well, David, thanks for joining us. It's always good to talk to you.
Great to be here, Dave. Keep it going.
David Coletto is the founder and CEO at Abacus Data. Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.